listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Yesterday, the government signed off on a massive business deal allowing Qatar Airways to buy 25% of Virgin Australia. So you might be wondering, what will this do to the price of your next flight?
Well, it means more seats to Europe from all of the major capital cities on the mainland, and what more seats means is lower prices.
In the second half of this episode, Bension Siebert dives into what this merger means for you and what it means for Virgin's biggest competitor, Qantas. But first, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It is Friday the 28th of February, the last day of the month, the last day of summer.
Oh, no. Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. That is devastating news that summer has come to an end. I'm sorry, I reacted prematurely. Hey, before we get into our first story of the day, I'd like us to hear from no other than Dolly Parton.
Oh, I wish that we could stop this divorce.
Dolly's wish, Australia's command. Our divorce rate is at the lowest level in half a century. That's according to the latest report by the Australian Institute of Family Studies, based off data from the Bureau of Statistics, which has revealed there were 2.3 splits for every 1,000 marriages in 2023. When a lot of us would have been growing up, which is the early 2000s, the divorce rate was significantly higher at 3.4 out of 1,000 marriages.
Yeah, so what's changed, I guess, is the question. For one thing, we are choosing to tie the knot later now. According to this latest report, the median age for wedded bliss is 30 for women and 31 for men, and that is 8 years older than the average in the mid-70s. Another factor is that more couples are living together before heading down the aisle, which they're saying is essentially a try before you buy period. Do I really want to marry this person? Maybe not. In 2023, 83% of couples had been living together before marriage, compared to just 16% in 1975. So yes, a lot of couples would be splitting up before a wedding ring and not adding to the divorce rate.
On top of all of that, a lot of us are simply choosing not to get married at all. The marriage rate in 2023 was 5.5 for every 1,000 adults. If we go back to the early 70s, that number was 13 per 1,000. And there was a post-COVID boom in weddings, which was 6.1 per every 1,000 adults. And that was up from 3.8 in 2020, which was very low for Australia. The stats show we're now closer to pre-pandemic levels, which show a long-term downward trend.
Yeah, so interestingly, the peak divorce rate came in 1976, and that was after the introduction of what's called no-fault divorce. So essentially before that, you had to have a reason and you had to often prove it. So you could accuse your partner of adultery, but it wasn't necessarily easy to prove it. And also there was a huge stigma around divorce. So once no-fault divorce came in, the divorce rate absolutely skyrocketed. Shock horror. Some other fun stats from this report. In 1970, 88% of marriages were performed by ministers of religion. Flip that, in 2023, 83% of marriages were performed by civil celebrants, which is super interesting. Almost 4% of all marriages are same-sex couples, and more women are getting married than men when it comes to same-sex relationships. And just lastly, the median duration of marriage for divorcing couples over the last decade was around 12 years, and the median duration of marriage to separation was 8.5 years. So if you are living in wedded bliss and you're like, oh, have I beat the odds? You've got to get to 8.5 years to beat the average before you separate. So, but that means if you look at those numbers, it takes around 3 to 4 years for separating couples to actually finalise a divorce. It is not a quick process. So, yeah, really interesting report out today.
Penny Wong has accused the coalition of stirring controversy over the Chinese warship saga. A reminder, this was the group of ships that conducted live fire drills last week in the Tasman Sea that caused 49 flights to be diverted. The Foreign Minister says the opposition is ignoring national security in favour of political attacks as the warships sail into the Great Australian Bight. Wong told Senate estimates yesterday within hours of the exercise the Australian government had made representations to China, and that's where they criticised the ships for being there without at least 12 hours notice, and they sought an explanation, and that dialogue continued this week when she met her Chinese counterpart in South Africa.
Some politicians seem to be insinuating that Australia is responsible for the PLA not providing more notice, when in fact we raised our concerns directly with China at military, diplomatic and political levels. And we now see gunboat diplomacy being added to the litany of war talk from the opposition. Such rhetoric does not make Australians safer.
Two things to note there. The PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army Navy of China, and gunboat diplomacy is a foreign policy that uses military force to achieve political goals.
So Wong's comments come as the coalition continues to accuse Labor of weakness on this issue, and that is amid questions over how long it took the government to become aware of the ship's presence, but importantly as well, what they were actually doing. So former Prime Minister Scott Morrison has weighed in. He told Sky News that Anthony Albanese hasn't been critical enough of China on this, and this should serve as a wake-up call. He also questioned whether the PM was making excuses for China, given he had initially claimed Australia was notified of the drill in advance. But defence officials have since confirmed the warning came through 30 minutes after it began. It is interesting to see ScoMo criticising the government on Chinese issues because we all know Mr. Morrison's record on China. He called for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID. That then led to a trade war, and that's just top line. So interesting to see him come out and make these comments right now.
And look, just on the warships, it is a really big layered story. We did deep dive it on Monday afternoon. The link to that is in the show notes. Mystery continues to surround the deaths of Hollywood heavyweight Gene Hackman, along with his wife Betsy and their dog at their New Mexico home. They were found dead by police who were carrying out a welfare check. Apparently, they'd been dead for some time. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office has given no cause of death just yet, but says there is no reason to suspect foul play.
As to theories about what could have happened, their families have suggested a gas or carbon monoxide leak could be behind their deaths, while prescription pills were also found at the home. But all local police are saying is that an investigation is ongoing. We have no cause of death. We don't know what happened. Now, a lot of us might not be familiar with Hackman. I know the name, but I couldn't think of anything I'd seen him in. But if you're wondering, he is being remembered in Hollywood as a great artist with a career of magnificent works.
It's nothing but a sick fantasy.
It's a fantasy? No. It's history. It's happening, Superman.
Over his years as an actor, he starred as Lex Luthor in the 1978 Superman movie. He also had starring roles in The French Connection, Unforgiving, The Birdcage, and Enemy of the State.
And Jeff Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, has announced an all-female crewed spaceflight, the first since a Soviet mission in 1963. And here is the hook, the big news out of this one, Sash. It will include Katy Perry. The singer, along with Oprah's bestie Gayle King, a bioastronautics research scientist, a former NASA rocket scientist, a film producer and a journalist who is also Bezos' wife, will blast off into an area 100 kilometres above Earth's surface where outer space begins.
No date has been named for the mission, known as NS-31, but Blue Origin says the flight will challenge these women's perspectives of Earth, empower them to share their own stories and create lasting impact that will inspire generations to come. So, sure, why not? Katy Perry and Gayle King going up into space. Gayle King is a journalist, of course. They've got another journalist who's Bezos' wife who's going on this trip as well. But something interesting is that the number of women who have been to space has actually increased as space tourism has grown. So in November, we saw a woman called Emily Calandrelli, who's an engineer and TV host known as Space Girl, become the 100th woman to venture into space, and she was on Blue Origin's NS-28 mission. So more ladies are getting into space. Hopefully NASA isn't still sending these women on 6-day missions with 100 tampons.
Oh gosh, and look, all this comes as that Melbourne physicist and businesswoman. She was etched into the history books this week, becoming the first Australian woman to travel into space. She was on board another Blue Origin flight, which left Earth's atmosphere earlier this week. And she, has been doing media all week talking about how brilliant space is and how exciting it is. And to your point, so exciting to see this happening, and go the ladies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Atta girls. All right. Thank you, Chris. Next up, we are getting into Bension's deep dive, looking at this big deal between Virgin Australia and Qatar Airways, what it means for Qantas, but also what it means for you.
Hey, Bension here. The government yesterday approved a deal that will let Qatar Airways buy a quarter of Virgin Australia. The deal means an extra 28 flights a week, and there's hope more competition in the sector equals cheaper airfares going forward. The Treasurer greenlit the deal with some caveats, including a guarantee of Aussies on the Virgin board and protection of customer data. You might remember the political shitfight when Labor knocked back a bid by the same airline to operate more routes in Australia in 2023, with the opposition and others accusing the government of being far too cosy with Qantas. The man who led that charge, author of The Chairman's Lounge and founder of new Australian media company Rampart News, Joe Aston, is here to tell us what this is all going to mean and what Qantas might be feeling about it all. Joe Aston, welcome to the briefing. Top line, what does this deal mean for Australians?
Well, it means more seats to Europe from all of the major capital cities on the mainland, and what more seats means is lower prices. And we all know how high airfares have been over the last few years, 2022 and 2023 with a real peak. And I think it's fair to say that prices have come off a fair bit since then. But this is only going to help even more, where you've got a plane load of available seats out every single day out of Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth up to Doha and then into all of the other cities that Qatar Airways flies to, not just London, but, all across Europe and the Middle East. So that's great for travellers. And the only thing is how does it work in the long term? Like Qantas is jumping up and down about it because they understand that Qatar has an advantage because its labour is cheaper and its fuel is cheaper and it's backed by the government. That's great for Virgin Australia. As far as I'm concerned, what's good for Qantas or bad for Virgin, it's sort of less interesting to me as what's good for the Australian punter. We all want to be able to go overseas. We live at the far end of the universe. And what's most important is that we can get to London for, less than $5,000 in economy, which is the crazy situation that we had 2 or 3 years ago.
Does it mean cheaper flights sort of across the board, or does it literally just mean cheaper flights to those locations that we're getting new routes for now?
Unfortunately, it will only really affect Europe because, if you're Qantas or United or Delta or whatever, you're not going to lower your prices between Australia and America just because there's more competition on Europe. It's very specific. And unfortunately, actually, if you look at where the prices are the least competitive, it's actually on the United States. If you want to fly to LA, the prices are still crazy. The prices that Qantas is charging on those routes is crazy. But yeah, so it's very specific to Europe, but that's a very big part of Australians' travel plans, particularly leisure travel plans. Young people are far more likely to want to go away in the European summer than they are probably to the US, where, as you go. I've just come back from the US a couple of days ago. I felt like I was spending, I was pulling my Australian pesos out of the ATM every day, and I was going broke just buying a coffee. The euro's not quite as bad.
Yeah. Will this happen more or less immediately, or when does it all start?
Yeah, so the flights themselves start in June, and they're already on sale. So that downward pressure on price has already happened because that's already a live situation. And the way it actually works is there'll be Virgin flight numbers. You buy the tickets from Virgin, but you go to the airport and it will be a Qatar Airways plane with Qatar Airways crew, which is called wet leasing. And despite Qantas jumping up and down about how unfair it is, Qantas itself actually wet leases from Finnair. So if you buy a Qantas ticket from Sydney to Bangkok, for instance, or on some flights between Sydney and Singapore, the exact same thing happens. You turn up at the gate expecting to get on a Qantas plane and you've got a Finnair aircraft with Finnair crew. So it's not uncommon. The real issue is it fair in the long term for Virgin to be able to basically use a foreign entity to run its international network and basically pay lower labour rates? It's not really great for Australian jobs in the long run. So I do sort of understand Qantas's argument, but Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, has extracted some guarantees from Virgin and Qatar that over time that will be a transition, that those flights will involve Virgin pilots and Virgin cabin crew So we all should remember the only reason this has even been necessary is because the Albanese government blocked Qatar Airways from increasing its own number of flights to Australia in 2023. So they wanted to double their flights. Qantas lobbied against that when Alan Joyce was the CEO. Anthony Albanese, who was very close to Alan Joyce, his government stopped it from happening. And so this is really just a workaround where Qatar Airways then said, okay, we'll buy 25% of Virgin, and then we can do this cute little manoeuvre where we just do it by wet leasing. And so they've sort of outmanoeuvred Albanese in many ways. And I think the government understands that the last thing they want with an election campaign about to start is to make airfares and Qantas and aviation policy a problem for them in the election. So I think Jim Chalmers has done the smart thing politically and the right thing by the travelling public.
Next time I fly on Virgin to Europe, do I have to think to myself, thanks, Joe Aston, for all the pressure that you've put on the government over all these years about its very cosy relationship with Qantas? Is this you?
I think that'd be a bit of a stretch. As much as I'd love to take credit, there are many, many people involved in something like this happening. I think the Australian travelling public, rather than thanking me or anyone else, should probably still feel a little bit forlorn at the situation. Sure, there's better competition to Europe, but there's still crap competition domestically. You're still paying incredible prices, and especially if you're not fortunate enough to live in Sydney or Melbourne or one of the big cities. If you live in Tamworth or Albury or Rockhampton, you're getting absolutely reamed by Qantas Link. And particularly since the collapse of Rex, which, by the way, Rex has to take its own responsibility for. But, there are good things happening. This is all positive, but there's lots to still be concerned about in the lack of competition in Australia in aviation. I mean, people complain about price gouging at supermarkets. I know that's a big political issue. I can tell you there is no price gouging happening in supermarkets, anything to the extent that is happening in aviation.
Is there anything on the horizon that would change that in domestic settings?
No, absolutely not. I almost felt last year that there was a moment where I thought politicians were going to put their hands up and say, okay, we won't be members of the Qantas Chairman's Lounge anymore. We're all going to fly the cheapest airfare of the day rather than taking the sweet deal from Qantas. But ultimately, the politicians decided to just go very quiet and hope it would blow over. And surprise, surprise, it did. The sad thing is I don't see any prospect of things changing in the long run, where we live at the very far end of the world and our politicians do not put us first when it comes to the airline system in this country, which is like an absolutely critical piece of infrastructure because of where we are. We're this huge continent at the end of the world, and you can't drive, to and from Melbourne or to and from Brisbane for a meeting.
Should Australians be worried about a foreign government-owned company owning a big stake in an Australian airline?
No, they shouldn't, because it's not new. Qantas is, I haven't checked recently, but last time I checked, they were 30% foreign-owned themselves. So foreign ownership of Australian companies is as old as the hills, and that's the way the global market works. In terms of foreign airlines owning Australian airlines, that is also not new. 20 years ago, British Airways owned 25% of Qantas, and before Virgin went broke in 2020, it was 90% foreign-owned by Etihad, Singapore Airlines, a couple of Chinese airlines, and, of course, Richard Branson's Virgin Group, which is still a shareholder today. So, look, it's a dime a dozen. Look, if I was Qantas, I would be annoyed that Qatar Airways was a 25% shareholder of Virgin, because that makes Virgin a really strong competitor for the first time in a long time, because Qatar's a serious operator. They're a very, very good player, and they own 25% of British Airways, Iberia. They own a big stake in Cathay Pacific in Hong Kong. They own stakes in airlines all around the world. And, to be honest, Qantas could have been in partnership with Qatar themselves if Alan Joyce had have done that instead of deciding to get into bed with Emirates. So I don't think this is in and of itself something to worry about.
The Qatari government has a terrible human rights record: wage theft, discrimination against queer people, migrant workers dying, building football stadiums. Was there no better option for Virgin?
That's a good question, and absolutely in no way take my answer to be minimising any of those things which are unacceptable. But if you look at this in relative terms, Qantas is in partnership with Emirates, and human slavery is rampant in the United Arab Emirates as well. Like, if we judged airlines based on the human rights record of their home country, then half of the airlines in the world wouldn't fly to Australia. I mean, what about all the Chinese carriers that fly in and out of Australia? Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be an apologist for human rights abuses, but I don't think that we should start taking those things into sort of the calculation when we decide on how the international airline system works.
How do you think this deal will impact jobs in Australia, wages in Australia in aviation?
Well, in aviation, it's not great for jobs. The thing with economics is it's always hard to do the counterfactual, but this deal doesn't create Australian jobs in aviation. But what the extra flights do is create Australian jobs in other parts of the economy, because all of the people that travel on these extra flights, they buy coffee, they stay in hotels, they shop, they hire cars, and all of that adds to economic activity, which creates Australian jobs. The issue is, how do you make sure that Virgin doesn't just use Qatar Airways as its permanent international network, and how does the government sort of force Virgin Australia to use this as a transition to having its own flights, not just use this as a permanent fix? And I think you'll find that the TWU and other unions are right up the government's clacker on that issue.
And in terms of human rights, etc., if someone is flying on one of these flights, could they be worried that the people of the crew or the pilots might be being underpaid or exploited in some kind of a way? Or is that not happening in aviation for Qatar?
Again, that's a really good question. It's objectively the case that Qatar crew are paid a lot less than Qantas crew or Virgin crew. But having said that, if you're worried about exploitation, labour exploitation in aviation, then you wouldn't fly Jetstar, because the Asian labour hire crew the Jetstar Asia flights are paid absolutely appalling wages as well. So this is the issue. When you start to get into those issues of morality, you've got to remember, like, everyone's playing the same game. There's no airline in the world, I can promise you, that's saying, how can we pay our staff more? How can we make sure that we're paying our staff the maximum amount? They're all in a race to the bottom, and by necessity, to be fair, because if you're paying your staff $25 an hour and your competitor is paying their staff $5 an hour, you can't compete with them and you can't charge the same airfares because you can't make the same money. So there's a lot of complexity in that. But yes, Qatar Airways is not going to be paying the highest wages in the world in aviation. They're certainly also not going to be paying the lowest. And if you're going to be consistent, then if you had that concern when you were flying on Qatar, then you'd have to have the same concern when you were flying Etihad, Emirates, Malaysian Airlines, and certainly Jetstar. So you got to bear all that in mind.
Okay, Joe Aston, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Joe Aston there, author of The Chairman's Lounge and founder of Rampart News. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you liked this ep, why not share a link with a friend? We really appreciate it. And happy Friday. The Briefing is made by Jess Wukyanov, Sasha Barbagat, Chris Spiru, Helen Smith, Matt Curry, Chris Marsh, and me, Bension Siebert. We'll have another ep for you this afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Listener.